Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. We're so delighted that you're joining us here today. Welcome to Probable Meets Possible. The Bell Museum and the College of Biological Sciences launched this online series last spring, a whole year ago, to bring together University of Minnesota scientists in bio-based fields to talk about the probable challenges we face and the possible advances that could have a profound impact on our future. These conversations, which you can find in a playlist on the Bell Museum's YouTube channel, have engaged audiences in exciting conversations about microbial communication, life in extreme environments, the consequences of climate change on water availability and ice cover, and the business outlook for sustainable products and socially conscious investing. My name is Holly Menninger, and I'm the Director of Public Engagement and Science Learning at the Bell Museum. We are proud to be Minnesota's State Natural History Museum and a public gateway to research at the University of Minnesota. Our mission at the Bell is to ignite curiosity and wonder, explore our connections between nature and the universe, and create a better future for our evolving world. And today, with the help of our scientist guests, we will engage in some future thinking about what lies ahead for ourselves and the planet in the face of a changing climate. We are grateful to our partners in this series, the College of Biological Sciences, led by Dean Valerie Forbes, and the CBS communications team, including Stephanie Zenos and Claire Wilson. Thank you. Now, let me introduce our guests for today. Dr. Heidi Roop is an assistant professor of climate science in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota. She unites her rich background in climate science and science communication to provide climate change information to key stakeholders in local communities and abroad. Dr. Jennifer Powers is a professor in the departments of ecology, evolution, and behavior, and plant and microbial biology at the University of Minnesota. She is an ecologist who largely works in tropical ecosystems, studying the cycling of elements and ecosystem processes at local, regional, and global scales. Our topic for today, leveling up to combat climate change. This afternoon, Heidi and Jennifer will provide a brief overview of their research in climate science and offer up insights about how working across scales is necessary and important for developing and implementing climate solutions. We'll have brief presentations from each researcher and then open up the floor to conversation. A few technical notes. Please send in your questions and comments for our guests directly through the chat box. Our team will be monitoring and curating those for our conversation after the presentations. You may have also noticed that we have turned closed captioning on. If you find that distracting, you can hide it by clicking on the live transcript button in your Zoom bar. We are also recording this webinar and we'll post it online on the Bell Museum's YouTube channel. Okay, so now it's time for me to stop talking and to turn it over to Dr. Heidi Roop from the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. Heidi, take it away.
Great, thank you, Holly, and thank you all for spending the end of the day with us together. So as a climate scientist, I sort of swim in the land of probabilities, and I have the privilege of having a job where I get to spend a lot of my days inspired by the possibilities that exist across scales in confronting the challenges that we'll face in Minnesota and around the world as a consequence of our changing climate. But I think it always is important to start a discussion like this that can be difficult and emotional and hopefully inspirational with a reminder of what we're talking about, and that is our home. And so I'm just going to have us all take a second here at the end of the day and take a couple of deep breaths and just reflect on this image and what it evokes for you as we talk about this place we call home and how we've changed it. So just take a second and maybe take a deep breath and be prepared to enter into this conversation with us today. So that's not enough time really to do proper reflection, but I don't have a lot of time with you today. So we'll zoom through this, but just I hope you hold this powerful image from space of Earth in your head as we walk through and think about both probabilities and possibilities when it comes to thinking about the future of our planet under climate change. So, of course, when we think about the Earth, it's of course hard to understand and comprehend the scale at which we have changed things, right? Climate change indicates and our measurements and observations demonstrate that we have changed Earth's climate system in measurable and tangible ways. And those changes translate into meaningful impacts on people, community, ecosystems. Insert the thing you care about. Climate change is there, either as an underlying assumption or a newfound challenge to that thing. We have warmed our planet by around 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s. So the change is here and it's now. And again, that's still hard to comprehend. What does 2 degrees Fahrenheit mean? What does that look like? What does that feel like? And of course, climate change is happening on scales that are not so hard to comprehend. Those are changes in our own backyard. Those are changes to the things, to the communities that we care about. Here's an example. This is Mexico Beach after Hurricane Michael in 2018. And I think this image is rather poignant, in part because we can see the devastating impacts of, say, a hurricane, which we know are strengthening and becoming more numerous as a result of warmer oceans and a warmer planet. And we can see that in these cases, some buildings are left standing while others are not. And I spend a lot of my time, and I'll go into this a little bit further, thinking about how it is we prepare and design communities for the changes we've already set in motion. So not only are we observing the changes, we know there's more change in store. And so one of the questions we have is not only how much we prevent further warming from happening, but how prepared we are for those changes that have yet to come. This is an example. And of course, there's a whole lot here, and we can talk about this in the discussion about why this house is standing. But this is an example of an individual who had the capacity and the resources to build and design and retrofit their house because they were concerned about a change in the strength and intensity of hurricanes in this region in Florida. And you can see that those investments in this context paid off. It also paid off for the house behind it. But I think it gives you a complex picture of the challenges and the opportunities of confronting climate change. Oops, sorry. So when we think about emissions, we of course need to achieve, and this is set forth by the Paris Climate Agreement, the international science and policy communities, we need to achieve net zero by mid-century to avoid the target of exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, a global average warming relative to the pre-industrial. So we've got a lot of work to do, and there's an urgency to act, and there's an urgency to scale up our solutions and the deployment of these solutions and emissions reductions. Of course, that brings us to this question today, is it possible? And the short answer is yes, it's possible with profound systems change. How close are we to achieving this target? As I've already said, we've warmed the planet by around 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And we are rapidly approaching that 1.5 degree C target. This is a plot produced in 2017 by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in a special report. And essentially the take home is we have about a decade from that point of current emissions to sort of reach that target. So we're headed towards this window. This is the plot from which the sort of 10 years left narrative has been derived. The main take home is that we're headed in a direction that will get us to this unfortunate target sooner rather than later. Time is of the essence. There are many, many ways. So when we think about probabilities and possibilities, there are tons of experts who look at how we get there. And these are simulations of reductions in CO2, so pathways for emissions reductions that can get us to this target. But they all share commonalities. And the primary thing I'll point out here, and again, we could go into this in great detail, is that we need steep near-term reductions in emissions. And every single one of these pathways also requires sort of this last mile challenge of carbon removal or sort of carbon capture and storage. So the sort of some of this is technology based. So point here, there are lots of ways to get there, but time is of the essence. To put this in context with the pandemic, global emissions need to fall around just under 8% every year this decade in order to limit the warming to that 1.5 degree C target. This is about on par with the emissions reductions that we saw over the last year as a result of sort of this rapid transformation that happened into society as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. a pandemic is not the way that we get there, and the disproportionate impacts of that is certainly not the way that we would advocate that we get these emissions reductions. But I hope this provides sort of that scale, the scale of change required to achieve these goals. So is it probable? And this, of course, is hard for scientists. I'm not going to give you one answer, but we look and live in probabilities, and this isn't exactly technically looking at a probability, but we look at scenarios, and we, within these scenarios, look at what happens on certain emissions pathways. So this is sort of an inversion of that curve, but of the curves I showed previously. But what we're looking at here is what happens if we stay on a high emissions pathway versus bending our curve down and getting on a low emissions pathway. What happens to global average temperature? You can see there's a wide spread between the blue line and the red line. And a lot of people like to tell climate scientists like me, the spread in this is because you don't understand climate science. And the climate models don't really capture what's going to happen. And there's so much uncertainty. We can't really plan for any of these futures. How would we know what line to follow? And in simple terms, I would just counter that right now, the greatest source of uncertainty in what the future holds is people and human behavior. What do we choose to do as a society for which path we follow? And that in turn will dictate the amount of future warming that we will experience, and then the subsequent impacts that follow from that warming. And so I think a lot about people and the complexity of people and society and decisions. And I partner with people who think a lot about policy and people and behavior change and systems change. And when we think about the probabilities of confronting this challenge, we have to think about climate change science as being a piece in this puzzle, this complex puzzle that relates to decision-making and sort of how society operates, right? There's competing priorities, there are competing drivers that either accelerate or limit our ability to change and change at scale across the sort of systems that we are needing to influence and rapidly transform to meet these global targets. So this is, of course, it's a piece in the puzzle. It's not the only piece, and it can't stand alone, right? This is done in collaboration. I've already touched on this a little bit, but the other place where sort of people fit in, and we can hopefully discuss this a bit more in the discussion piece, which is, of course, there's this big absolute imperative that we focus on the prevention of further warming through reducing our emissions. There's no question. But we also have to prepare for the changes we set in motion. So when we think about how we're going to feel climate change, what is it going to look like? What is it that we're planning for? We have to take into account how well we are balancing and considering sort of two parts of this equation, the prevention and the preparation. And if we get those things right, we can look at that possibility, the inspirational sort of possibility of addressing all sorts of other systems change and societal issues as we seek to transform society in a climate ready and a climate smart way. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and a whole host of global experts have come together to sort of identify what are key ingredients or other key sort of puzzle pieces that we need to get there to both address this prevention piece, but importantly, this preparation piece. And you're going to hear a bit about this in sort of concrete terms in the next presentation. But we really need to be thinking about how we're collaborating and coordinating, how we're drawing on different ways of knowing and different knowledges, how we're deepening and having meaningful public deliberation and conversations, how we're prioritizing social vulnerability and equity, how we're thinking about building governance capabilities at a variety of scales, and of course, supporting climate change related decision-making in sort of unexpected places. So as I said earlier, there's sort of climate changes everywhere. Climate solutions and climate discussions need to be everywhere as well. And so I'm running out of time here. So I'm going to have us zoom back out to space, and we're going to spend a second thinking about a different celestial body, which is the moon. So this is the moon. And not that long ago, there was a question about, is it possible to walk on the moon? And of course, we all know that in fact, it was possible, and we rose to the challenge and we did it. And of course, our geopolitics were motivating us, and there was significant advancements in science that all enabled this to happen. This is Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. And when you look back at records, exploring how this became possible and how we achieved this grand milestone in human history, Neil Armstrong has been quoted to say, it took us a decade of work to, quote, pull it off. I think that's really important when we think about climate change, because as I've just described, we have about a decade to pull off this grand challenge. And so we need to take a different kind of leap for humankind today, and that is one towards a climate-ready future. And I find inspiration in this, and I hope we can use this in the conversation to think about this, which is that Neil Armstrong was quoted saying, and apparently he was a very humble person, asked about, this grand achievement. He responded by saying, it wasn't really me. It was hundreds of thousands of people all doing their jobs a little bit better than they had to, that led to the improvement in performance that allowed them to pull off getting to the moon, right? This massive achievement that many thought was impossible, they achieved in under 10 years, and we put people on the moon, right? And his comment here is really about, it's an all hands on deck situation. We all have a responsibility to think about, to do, and to improve our performance just a little bit so that we can achieve this grand and critical target for our planet. So when we have hundreds of thousands of people thinking about their jobs and doing their jobs just a little bit better than they have to in the context of climate change, I'd argue that this is a way we can improve our performance. And it's really a central ingredient for how we are going to pull this whole thing off. So my question today that I hope we can explore is sort of, how will you help us at the scale at which you operate and with the expertise that you bring to help us pull off this grand challenge? And I think it's really important that we consider how we best collaborate to combine our diverse knowledge, our expertise, and our perspectives to achieve this, because it is, in my mind, possible, but the probability depends on us and what we choose to do. So with that, I will pass it to my colleague who can give you a maybe more concrete example of what's possible and probable when you think innovatively and collaborate.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you for leaving. I'm excited to dive into the discussion, and I will encourage all of our audience members to use the chat box. You can feel free to ask some questions now. We'll be curating those behind the scenes for our conversation later. Maybe just in the transition, I wanted to ask a question actually from Artie, someone watching in the audience, about who asked, what is meant by unexpected places where climate decisions are made? You alluded to that as you were wrapping up that up and having this sort of the call to the audience. So
yeah, I think just in brief, and we can dive into that more, but I think when we have these conversations, we think a lot about where we individually can reduce our emissions, driving electric vehicles and all these things. And we often aren't considering the systems that we rely on every day, where climate change decisions are imperative, or where an assumption about climate change is embedded in those systems. So a great example are roads and bridges. Those are designed using climate information. They're designed using observed records of temperature change, right? We build concrete and this sort of infrastructure to be tolerant to certain temperatures, to be able to manage a certain amount of water. Our drinking water systems, our stormwater systems, these are all built and designed using climate information, but rarely are they designed using future climate information. And so these sort of unexpected places, right? It's the tap to toilet, it's the everything in between, where I think we still need to be having conversations about the relationship of climate change to that thing, to that object, to that decision. It's in our foodways, it's in supply chains, it's in our emergency and disaster preparedness. It's kind of this everywhere challenge, and those they're maybe not unexpected, but maybe they're, a better word would be sort of unexplored places, or underappreciated, where factoring in, sort of passing a climate lens across those things and thinking, how is climate change going to stress or challenge this infrastructure, this ecosystem, this community, can be really meaningful ways that we make climate progress.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that question, Artie. All right. Now I'm going to turn it over to our next guest, Dr. Jennifer Powers. Take it away. Share your screen.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate everyone tuning in to listen to this. And I especially appreciate Heidi Roop's comments, because I think she really set the stage for thinking locally, for thinking globally. And what I'd like to talk to you about is one example of possible, probable solutions that we can think about to meeting this grand challenge of mitigating climate change. So I don't think there could have been a better person to talk to you before me than Dr. Roop. So thank you. So this is a tree. It's the largest tree on Barro Colorado Island in Panama. In the center of this picture, you can see me. You can also see a couple other faculty from the University of Minnesota, including Dr. George Weiblen, who's in the red t-shirt and is also part of the Bell Museum, and Dr. Rebecca Montgomery, who's in the white t-shirt. This tree is enormous. It fills up the picture. If we were to cut down this tree and dry it and grind it up and measure the carbon that is stored in this tree, we would find that about 50% of the dry weight of this tree is carbon. When I get my start in tropical ecology, I spent a lot of time working in the old growth forests like that one in Panama. But now I spend a lot more time working in places like this. I took this picture in outside of Cali, Colombia, and this shows a place where a forest used to be. So what is the problem with this? Well, if we take forests and we cut them down and we burn them, which is a common land use practice, all of that carbon that's stored in the biomass of the trees is quickly released to the atmosphere. So that comprises a large flux of carbon to the atmosphere. Deforestation contributes to climate change wherever it happens, in the tropical zone, in the temperate zone, in the boreal zone. If we're cutting down trees and we are burning them, this is adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So deforestation adds greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. This is a spiny forest in the south of Madagascar, and you can see that it has charismatic fauna like these dancing lemurs. Nature-based solutions to climate change try to take what I just told you, that cutting down forests contributes to CO2 emissions to the atmosphere and climate change, and use this in reverse. So if deforestation leads to increased greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, does regrowing forests remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Is this part of the solutions that we can use to mitigate climate change? So is the reverse true? Can we use forest restoration to help mitigate climate change? So this is a picture from, this is a picture I took from an area very close to where that spiny forest was. This is a landscape that used to be spiny forest, but that forest has been cut down and this landscape has been converted to agriculture and to grazing lands. And for many years, we didn't know, we meaning the tropical ecology community, if it was actually possible to restore tropical forests. For decades, people thought this wasn't even possible. Once we cut down a tropical forest, it's gone for good. So this debate over whether it's even possible, is it possible to regrow these forests, it's spilled out into the popular press. These are articles from the New York Times and from Nature News. And part of this debate was really spurred by a lack of knowledge, just a data void. We didn't know the extent to which it's possible to regrow these forests. We didn't know their value in terms of carbon or other attributes. So in part to help fill this data void, my group has been working on studying these processes of secondary forest regeneration in the tropics for now almost 2 decades. So we spend a lot of time working in places like this, and we ask questions like, how much carbon can secondary forests store? What factors affect forest regeneration? Can we jumpstart forest recovery? And what are the co-benefits of forest restoration? And I would argue that this is really where I think the possible meets the probable. Is it possible to regrow these forests? And if so, how likely is society to invest in these secondary forests? Is it probable that we'd actually choose this as a climate change solution? So this is the area in northwestern Costa Rica where much of my research is focused. This is what the Guanacaste conservation area looked like many decades ago when it was established in the early 70s. And the goal of establishing this protected area or this national park was really to try to regrow and restore the dry forest ecosystem. This is what the Guanacaste conservation area looks like now. What you can see here is a mature secondary forest. So how did they achieve this forest restoration and forest regeneration? Well, on the one hand, by assessing the barriers to regeneration and then using appropriate technologies to address those barriers or overcome those barriers. In the case of the dry forest, anthropogenic fires are the major threat or the major barrier that prevents regeneration. So the protected area, the national park, they set up a series of fire lookouts. And when they identified a fire, they would send these guys with a bunch of brooms to come and sweep a little fire line along around the fire. And by and large, this worked. So this process of assisted natural regeneration through fire management works in this area in Costa Rica. My group has been studying this, again, for almost 20 years. Does this work everywhere? Well, this is a recent paper that collated all of the studies of forest regeneration in the Americas. So in Central America, the Caribbean, and Latin America, and including studies, including data from my group. And what we did was to measure the distribution of secondary forests and then estimate how much carbon could be sequestered if the current secondary forests are just allowed to regrow for 40 years. What we found was that if we allow the secondary forest that exists right now to grow for 40 years, that can remove 31 petagrams or 10 to the 15 grams of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. To put that in a different context, that's the equivalent to all fossil fuel emissions from Latin America from 1993 to 2014. So yes, it is possible to restore these forests using assisted or natural regeneration, but this doesn't always work. Sometimes nature needs a little help. These are extremely degraded soils in Costa Rica where regeneration is not happening. This is one of my former graduate students, Leland Worden, and his dissertation was concerned with using or developing restoration practices to reestablish tree cover on these very degraded soils through tree planting. This is an example of some of his data. We grew 32 species of native trees, and then we planted them out into these degraded soils. And what we did was identify tree species that are useful for restoration. This project took place under an extreme drought. And so what we found is that if we're thinking about restoration, we need to be thinking about the future climates, not these current climates. So yes, is restoration and forest regeneration possible? Yes, we can get carbon back on the land. But is it probable? I would argue that society will only invest in this strategy for mitigating climate change if there are other co-benefits aside from carbon sequestration. So in my group, we've been able to identify these different species in our secondary forests in Costa Rica. As a plant ecologist, I just assumed that if the plants come back, and clearly we can see this biodiversity coming back in the secondary forest, that the animals will follow. And it turns out that that's pretty much right. Dr. Tim Truer was a PhD student from Princeton, and he came down to our secondary forest plots, and he put in camera traps so we could identify which animals are coming back to these forests. So in our secondary forest plots, we found coyotes. We found vested anteaters. This is a mother anteater and sort of a teenage anteater on her back. He's probably too old to be riding his mother's back. We found this great curassow. We found a tapir, and we found pumas. These are animals that only exist because of these regrowing secondary forests. They would not be here if there weren't these forests. But this biodiversity supports more than just trees and animals. It also supports local communities. These are environmental educators in the Guanacaste Conservation Area, and they have a environmental education program that targets 4th, 5th, and 6th graders throughout the province. And these kids come to the conservation area and they are told the natural history stories of the plants and animals that live in these forests. This biodiversity also supports careers. This is Gabriela Gutierrez. She's the director of the biological education program. These forests also support research and discovery. This is my research group, or part of them in Costa Rica, including 2 graduate students from University of Minnesota. It also supports ecotourism. Local tour operators bring tourists to these forests. It also supports pollination services for agriculture, for local agricultural industries. The conservation area, or the protected area, is in the back. And what you can see here is an orange orchard in the foreground. And this orchard is pollinated by insects that live in the forest. Last, these regenerating forests also support ecosystem services like water provisioning and watershed protection. Assisted natural regeneration, or forest regrowth, it can work in a number of different contexts, not just this the protected area we work in Costa Rica or the national park. We also work in Puerto Rico, in a state park. We have collaborators and work with people on a private farm in Colombia, and we work in a private reserve in Mexico. So this success story that we see in Costa Rica has been replicated many times throughout the tropics. What kinds of lessons can we learn? Well, is it possible? Yes, forest regeneration on these lands formerly used for agriculture in the tropics is possible. We can regrow these forests and in turn help reduce carbon dioxide emissions. But is it probable? Will society invest in this as a mechanism to help combat climate change? I would agree, or I would argue that that to really move beyond what's possible to what's probable, we need to also be talking about the co-benefits of forest regeneration. And these include things like biodiversity, education, jobs, livelihoods, and ecosystem services. And so I'm looking forward to our discussion. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Holly.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate your presentation. Before we bring Heidi back and give our audience a moment to get their questions down into the chat box, I want to ask you a question about, and bear with me because it may not be super articulate. Since forest regeneration seems like it's a good strategy for putting carbon back on the ground, who's going to do it, or who should do it? Because we've been talking about the scales of action from like individuals to, international collaborations. And so how will that effort sort of scale up and how will it be implemented, so to speak?
Well, I think, so that's a really good question. And I think that we need to take care when sort of working across these scales. Of course, things like the bond challenge, there's many large scale tree planting efforts. Now, those need to be thought out very carefully, because I would argue that, this is where these large scale efforts, if they're not implemented well, and by well, I mean in collaboration with the local people, with the people who work in these landscapes, then those are not likely to to be very successful. And so, why should we be planting? Why should we be allowing forest restoration? Why and where? I think from local scales of very small scale landowners derive benefit from having trees on their land. So trees can provide forage, trees can provide shade for animals. Even 2 or 3, I work with a NGO, and they're helping farmers plant 2, 3, 4, 5 trees on their land. Does that matter? Yes, it does. It brings benefits to those people. At the larger scale, again, things like the bond challenge, I think we need to be very thoughtful about where and how and why we're aiming to restore forests.
Yep. Can you explain what I don't know if I know what the bond challenge is. Can you explain just briefly what that is?
There are many now challenges or efforts to restore forest cover on large scale restoration efforts. So there's the trillion tree effort. There's many of these different sort of plans, I guess, to promote forest regrowth at very large scales.
Got it. All right. Now it's time for some conversation. I hope our audience has had some questions coming in, and I have a couple questions, and maybe you want to ask each other questions throughout too. But maybe I will kick it off. One thing, and you alluded to this a little bit, Heidi, that I hear repeated over the course of this last year is the advice of never waste a good crisis, and it's often talked about in a lot of different contexts. I'd be interested in your perspective. Have there been any lessons, opportunities, silver linings from this really tragic, hard last year that could help propel us forward in some way with respect to mitigating or adapting climate change? I know that's a big question, but I thought I'd throw it out there and see what you all think.
Yeah, I love big questions, and I'll maybe give you the thing that came to the top of mind, acknowledging that there are a whole lot of other angles and sort of personal and professional silver linings, right? It's a complex mix. But I think so. The first thing that comes to mind is the demonstration that where there's political will, there is a way, and I think this is sort of captured well in the development of a vaccine. And so I've heard other experts, and some of you may have heard similar reporting in the media, talking about, the development of, say, malaria vaccines, which have received far fewer resources than the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. And I think what, basically the take home is that there was a global crisis. Elected officials rose to the challenge, motivated by a variety of things, economics being one, yes, by the fact that it was impacting people in every country, including wealthy nations with potentially more research capacity. And of course, there's an inequitable distribution of the vaccines. But I think what it does show is that when there is a crisis and people decide that it's a priority, we can move resources and we can move and motivate expertise to solve real world challenges. And so it's an imperfect analogy, but I think it's a great demonstration, again, of, where there's a will, there's a way. And if we decide something's important and we decide that it's a priority and that it's a priority for, again, insert the thing you care about, whatever values are motivating that decision. I think when people come together, and importantly, when elected leaders come together who are responsible about making decisions on scales and large scales and across scales, we can do it, right? And there's, of course, going to be disagreement, and there's partisan divide around the response to COVID and all the other things, and we can tackle that if you want, misinformation, disinformation, right? It's a complex stew, but on the whole, where there's a will, there's a way. And it's incredible to see what science was able to achieve. And again, what society was able to achieve with an investment and some priority, right? And I think climate requires that same priority. We maybe haven't been as front and center. And I was just talking to someone today about this, and, I think, and they said, oh, well, climate change isn't, it's not really in your face. It doesn't really, it's a future far off thing. And I hope that in a small way, my talk, or if you're on this call, like, you realize that climate change is here and now. In 2020 alone, we had a record-breaking year for billion-dollar disasters in the United States. 22 billion-dollar disasters caused by natural hazards, one of which was a derecho in our backyard and our neighbors not too far away from here in Iowa. And we have had over $95 billion in damages in 1 year related to events that most science points to many of these events getting worse and more numerous under changing climate. So it's not that it's not here, it's that we're not talking about it and we're not prioritizing the deployment of solutions. So yeah, that's a long-winded way to say where there's a will, there's a way, and it should be in our face. And I think we're really good at ignoring it.
Jennifer, can you think of anything particularly in your domain of work where that stick out to you about sort of lessons learned? I did read the headline just this afternoon that deforestation in the tropics has actually accelerated in 2020.
Yeah, well, so I don't know if it's like good news from sort of my neck of the woods. I think Heidi's talk, where she talked about the moon landing, I think in some ways what we need, the COVID-19 crisis certainly has shown what we can do when we mobilize. I think this is our next moonshot. Yes, I think that in terms of thinking about how people interact with forests in tropical forests, there are, many livelihoods have been impacted by this crisis. People who live on the margins and don't have the ability to work from Zoom. And I think that those are some of the reasons where you find people increasingly desperate, doing what they need to survive. And, to get back to Heidi's point that, climate change is here, whether or not you see it, the places that I work, we see it all the time in the increasingly variable climate. Mm-hmm. The strong El Niños that lead to large mortality events in tropical forests. And these droughts also cause agriculture, they cause crop failure. So I think people, at least very close to the some of the study sites that we work in, are suffering from two pandemics. They are suffering from droughts, and they are suffering from these the global economic turndown or downturn with the pandemic. So people left with very few options. People are left with few options.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's what I would say. Yeah.
We have a question from Adam, and I'm gonna kind of take his question and expand on it as well, because Heidi, in your presentation, you were talking about thinking about you tap to toilet systems and thinking about that through the lens of climate change and future change. Adam's question is about, future climate conditions would impact how successful a regrown forest is. So do you consider, his question was to Jennifer, do you consider future climate projections when you are regrowing a forest? But then maybe we can expand that out to also include, Heidi, and sort of with some of the communities that you're working with about how you think about those climate projections for that work. But maybe Jennifer, you take that first, because the original question was for you, and then we can expand.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And so we work with, in my group, we work really closely with the Experimental Forestry and Restoration Station that's part of the Guanacaste Conservation Area. And the example that I gave of Leland Worden, who was doing his PhD, the goals of his PhD were just to get, to see what kind of management techniques we could use to regrow forests. But this is always kind of the luck with PhDs. He planted out 6,000 seedlings into the driest 2 years on record in this region. And what started out as a forest restoration experiment, and that's all we wanted to know, was really turned into a climate change experiment. And so we have a dialogue with the practitioners in this region to think about climate smart restoration. We can tell them based on the data that we have in our long-term plots, hey, these are species that can't cope with drought. If we're thinking about restoration, we need to be thinking not for the climate. We can't be restoring trees to our current climate. We need to be restoring trees for these future climates, which we know are going to be likely drier with more variable rainfall. And so that discussion about, how do we select species for restoration? How do we facilitate natural regeneration? Are those discussions from practitioners to sort of academics are happening against the backdrop of climate change. We have these discussions. Should we plant this? Absolutely not. They'll be dead in 2 years. That just has to be part of the discussion. It has to be part of the discussion.
How has it been part of the discussion, Heidi, with the communities that you're working with, particularly here in Minnesota?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends who's asking, and what decision is needing to be made, or what decision is they're working to motivate someone to make. And so, that's really a space that I'm working in my new position here, and really thinking about the sort of provision of climate data, future projections that will help people understand at a very regionally specific, community specific level. We have some hope that the state will fund, there will be some legislation that will support the generation of 3.5 mile, sort of 3 mile grid space climate projections data out to 2100 for all sorts of things: temperature, precipitation, evapotranspiration, which is important for like irrigation, all sorts, snowpack, lakes, anyway. So I think right now, of course, the data aren't the only thing that we need in order to do this work and to do it well. And I think there's this tension between how much information is enough information to make a decision. And so often I think we're looking at more information will make a different decision. And actually, when we look back, I don't think that's necessarily the case. And, that'd be great. It would put me out of business if everybody just did this work and did it now. Well, of course, science will always progress and our models will get better, and, there'll be new things to learn. That's science. So I will always hopefully have a foot in this space. But I think that the provision of the data are one thing, and that's something that is needed across the state. But there's also just more capacity building that's needed to understand, what are the implications of climate change across these different things? How is it that we embed climate and this conversation around climate in every every business line, right? Every function, every employee has some relationship to this topic and to the performance of whatever your mission is as a state agency or as a county or as a nonprofit or as a business. Thinking about climate kind of as an embedded question, I think is something we're still very much working towards, that will help us to make more meaningful progress. So that's a bit of a tangent from your exact question, but I think, again, as my presentations showed, the data and the climate science are one small piece of a much larger puzzle. And I think thinking about systems is important as we think about what's needed. And sometimes it's not more science, it's decisions.
We have a question from Barbara, who was wondering, reforestation in the neotropics can potentially reduce carbon emissions, but would reforestation also be useful outside of the neotropics here, particularly in a temperate zone?
Yes, I would say yes. And if you think about historic emissions, much of the land-based or the emissions from land in North America happened when the forests here were cleared. Much of, say, New England, those forests are secondary forests, they're regenerating. So yes, some of the things to think about when restoring forests is to ask, what was this land before it was somehow managed? Was this peatland? Was it a heath? Was it a grassland? And sometimes science has shown that if you're introducing trees to places, to ecosystems that did not support trees beforehand, that can have adverse effects on the hydrology, on the carbon storage on the carbon that's stored in the soils. And so I think restoration, reforestation, forest regeneration is one tool in our toolbox, but it's a tool that we have to apply with the knowledge of effects on hydrology, effects on soil carbon, and again, as Heidi mentioned, this all needs to be done. The science is one piece of the puzzle. The people are another piece of the puzzle. So I think that this is a potential solution, but again, it needs to be considered in this broader context.
Mm-hmm. Heidi, how are farmers or folks in agriculture thinking about sort of planting crops, and are there viable carbon sinks there? Or thinking about it, managing agricultural landscapes in a way to suck up carbon?
Yeah, and there's so much work and work at the university to looking at soil health as a climate solution and a way to enhance agriculture. And there's water quality benefits. There's all sorts of these co-benefits, right? Different than what we're talking about, but lots of co-benefits. There's the development of different cover crops and new crops that all are working in hope of sort of contributing to carbon capture and storage and reducing emissions from agriculture. But also while acknowledging, again, it's this sort of system, right? It's a complex system. We can have all the new crops that we want that are maybe good for soil health and prevent erosion and are, good kind of carbon friendly crops. But if we don't have markets for those crops, or it's not viable and a farmer can't make a living, right, then it's not really a deployable solution. And so those, of course, that complexity is being addressed through highly collaborative interdisciplinary teams that are bringing together farmers, the market experts, politicians, so it's a great, some of this work at the university, kind of like Forever Green and all of these other highly collaborative, interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral projects, I think are really good exemplars of what I'm talking about in terms of like the coordination and the collaboration. So it's not thinking about just the sort of development, say, of a new crop or of soil health in isolation from the system in which it operates, in hopes of kind of deploying systems-wide change, and one that is working in service of addressing climate along with all the other kind of co-benefits. And maybe it's not leading with the conversation around climate, but yeah, there is a lot of work underway and a lot of innovations and a lot of eager farmers. And there, of course, is, and I have lots of questions for Jennifer around, carbon capture and the idea of, carbon credits. And I think it's just a complex landscape. So I think the long and short answer is yes, I'm super excited by a lot of the work that's happening. People really thinking about partnership, collaboration, this sort of systems-wide thinking in order to really craft solutions that work and if that fit and also challenge the mold. And so, yeah, I find myself often really inspired by all of those things, even if I'm, and I don't know all the details, the nitty gritty. But I think there's a lot going on in the agricultural space.
Mm-hmm. There was a question about, because we're going to just like hit all the different kinds of landscapes. So we've got like the tropics, the temperate, we hit agriculture. Artie wants to know about grasslands and how does that compare to reforestation efforts for mitigating climate change? And I know it's probably complicated.
I'll add a little bit. In forests, a lot of that carbon is stored in the trees, like that really big tree that I showed you. But carbon can also be stored in the soil as soil organic matter. In grasslands, the grasses themselves may not have a lot of carbon, but they often have very, very deep roots, and that their roots contribute to the formation of soil carbon. As you know, if you wanted to take carbon and sort of stuff it somewhere in a pool, soil carbon is a good pool or a good place to stuff it because it has a longer mean residence time than, say, biomass or plants. Can we prioritize, or how would you evaluate whether it's better to maintain a land in grassland or plant trees? I think that you need to consider the ecological context of that. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that, planting a plantation of eucalypts on a former cattle pasture is not the same as restoring a diverse forest, likely not in terms of the carbon or in terms of the other co-benefits. So I guess I would say that, if for lands that have supported grasslands, that carbon is really stored in the soil, and that is a valuable place to store carbon. I don't know, Heidi, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I think the only thing I would add there is, and this is one of the hard parts of the job of sort of calculating the relative impact or efficacy of one thing over the other. And that is, I think, what was described too, right? All of these other benefits like biodiversity. And, so when we think about, I think there's a real opportunity to be more explicit about like, what are those co-benefits? So like carbon is, so these deep roots, right? There's this great potential for, and it's a great store of carbon. It also prevents erosion, which leads to benefits to the reduction in water quality issues. And sort of there's all of these, again, it's sort of thinking about systems, addressing the complexity and acknowledging that, of course, there are different benefits to different people and different users. And so making sure we're accounting for that when we think about this work and what we prioritize and what we invest in. And again, this is sort of like bringing the different knowledges in and the different sort of relationships that exist to a place or to a habitat or to a community, because those things all matter too, in addition to say how much carbon is captured, right? And so I think there's really those beautiful examples around sort of biodiversity and kind of the immediate response, both environmentally, but then there are also these sort of societal interactions, the sort of ecosystem and cultural management of resources that I think we can maybe be better about kind of weaving into our conversations. And I think Jennifer did a great job of demonstrating that. And I think there are, when we think about grasslands, all these other co-benefits, recreation, we increase the ability to recreate in some of these lands, and we bring, hunting, fishing, all of these sort of value systems come into play, and we just have to be able to name them and be better at naming them, I think.
Yeah. I want to be mindful of time. I feel like we could talk for an hour more, and the audience has sent in a lot of questions. I'll make sure that they get to both of you. Maybe we'll kind of end on the note of like sort of last bits of advice. I mean, we've talked about different scales from, individuals on up to large complex systems, global and beyond. Heidi even took us out into space to look at the moon. when you're having conversations with people about climate change and potential solutions, what is one or two sort of concrete steps that sort of we as individuals can take that may extend into spheres of influence and lead to some kind of, maybe connect to some larger systems changes, and kind of leave us on a note, an action item, if you will, for the audiences?
Okay, I'll tackle, these are two amongst the sea of things, but they're, again, the first that come to the top of mind. So the first one is, vote, because our dollars go by the way of the people that make the decisions on our behalf. So that's not a partisan statement, but, we need to vote in favor of the things that we value, right? And that we all have different values. And so I think when we live in a democracy and we think about large systems change, right? And the pandemic's a great example, right? Those weren't individuals, of course, were making decisions, but the broad investments of resources, the prioritization that was happening, most of that decision-making was happening by people who we elect to make decisions on our behalf. So that's one action, engage in our democracy, I guess, is one, as imperfect as it may be. And the second I would say is have conversations about climate. So many of us fill out polls and sort of think about the national narrative around this topic, and a majority of us agree that it's happening. A majority of us agree that it's going to impact future generations. Around 40% of us think it will have impact us personally. So we need to help people make those connections, the personal impacts, the personal connections. And only around a quarter of us hear about climate change in the media at least once a week. And so there's a lot of work to do. And so one way we can have agency in that is by having conversations, by making this a topic that we connect our own personal concerns to. And so it may seem small, but a minority of us talk about an issue that a majority of say is important. And I wonder how important is it if we're not willing to talk about it. So have a climate conversation.
Jennifer, what would you recommend?
I don't think I can add more than what Heidi just summarized really nicely. And I think just woven through everything she said, from voting to having climate conversations, is this mindfulness, is just acknowledging the reality of climate change. And I think that that first step puts you on this pathway of thinking more and acting more in your own life and then in society.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. And thank you to our audience. I hope that great questions from the audience. I'll make sure those get to both of our speakers today. And we're so grateful to you, both Heidi and Jennifer, for joining us today. So hopefully everyone at home is giving you a round of applause.